Cayley, author of Ivan Illich, An Intellectual Journey. As I understand it, it was published in April of last year. Francis Kissling, who's here with us today in Cuernavaca, received notice of the book, and she's the one that said we should see if we can organize a meeting with the author and invite people that are considered expats in Cuernavaca that may not be familiar with Ivan Illich. And she went ahead and contacted the author, who very graciously agreed to meet with us, and took a while to set the meeting, but he said that he would agree to an interview. We were hoping that he was going to be able to be present here, but it hasn't been possible. But he added one caveat, that whoever interviewed had to read the whole book. His book is massive. There's not a single photograph in it, except on the cover. And it's over 500 pages long. But thank you very much for Francis Kissling. This morning, as I was getting ready for this meeting today, I looked in the front cover of my book and I see that I made the notation, gift of Francis Kissling, 17 November 2021. So we're almost to the day of 7 months later, we're having the meeting. And so thank you very much, Francis, for persevering. And she was able to get Carol Hopkins interested in this project also. And all of those of you that are present here and on the Zoom call have had ample correspondence with Carol. Thank you very much, Carol. And she has also not only sort of managed the whole setup, she's also hosting the reception, which I can see spread out on the table here in front of me. I'm sorry to be talking about it with those of you that are online, but that's the way these things are. And of course, wouldn't be able to be talking to you if it weren't for Steve Farmer, our information technician here, who has jumped all kinds of hurdles to be able to have us have a hybrid meeting with some people present and others online. We should also, of course, give special thanks to Professor Gustavo Millán at the Department of Philosophy in the National Autonomous University in Mexico. And not only has he been able to get this national university to be a sponsor of the event, he's also managing this Zoom hookup on the National University's good quality Zoom account. And interpreter Lilia Rubio is carrying out the translation from English to Spanish. So we'll be speaking the whole time in English, and she will be translating Spanish. Our plan is to talk for, we also owe special thanks to Monica Macisi at the Iberoamericana University in Mexico City, and to her colleagues who have been promoting this meeting. It sounded like a very simple thing that we were just going to have one meeting. I can foresee that this is going to be going on into the future, and it's an amazing book. And this interview, I suppose, is quite unique because, of course, we know that the topic, Ivan Illich, is the one that is bringing us all together. But as you get more and more familiar with this book, the author himself, David Cayley, is a major factor. And he has given us a tremendous gift in putting this book together. It's been a project for many years, and we're going to be delving into it today. It was David Cayley who chose the 4 chapters that he suggested that we focus on, expecting that since it was hard to get the book, and certainly it's a major project to read the book, that if it would be good if people focused on 4 chapters, which are the church, the chapter 3, church, chapter 12, corruptio optimi pessima, chapter 13, apocalypse, and the conclusion, an intellectual journey. Interestingly, these are not the chapters that deal with Cuernavaca in particular. There's one called Cuernavaca. There's a lot of information about CIDOC in it and Cuernavaca. And at the beginning, I wondered, why did he do that? But I don't know what his reasoning was. Maybe these chapters are the newer ones that he's worked on. I hope he'll tell us about that. And but it's stretching our minds for those that are reading the book to get into all of these other topics that deal with Ivan Illich, when it would have been so easy just to end up swapping Ivan Illich stories. And so thank you very much, David, for making the choices be challenging ones. David Cayley is an interviewer, as well as author of a book. I've watched him on other interviews, and he's, I hope he will do the same here that I've seen him do on other interviews, is that he can get the information that is important, that he might not have been asked about, into the conversation. And I'm hoping you will do that also. But one of the things that struck me with the topics that you gave us is that those of us here in Cuernavaca that knew Ivan Illich knew him as a revolutionary. We know that he is a Catholic priest. He was a Monsignor. He was the youngest Monsignor appointed in the Archdiocese of New York by Cardinal Spellman. And he started out his project in Cuernavaca as a school for Catholic priests and members of religious orders. As we'll hear about more, and I'm sure you're all aware of, Ivan Illich got into some issues with the Catholic Church, and they were exacerbated by a essay titled "The Seamy Side of Charity," and the program that he had set up here in Cuernavaca was to train priests and nuns Spanish in Cuernavaca, or Portuguese if they were in a similar school in Brazil, to be able to carry out work in Latin America. The seamy side of charity went counter to that, and he, by 1968 or 68, he was resigning from his priestly duties as a Catholic priest. But something that David Cayley has presented to us in the chapter on the church and throughout the book is an interesting, very interesting idea that the Catholic Church is a model for the modern state. And now a new liberty had become possible, says David. The legal codes and the clerical bureaucrats first elaborated in the 11th and 12th centuries had long served their purpose and become a millstone around the church's neck. Reformers in the Middle Ages had fought for the liberty of the church and ended up creating a sovereign institution so impressive that it became a model of the modern state. And it's a topic that I would like David to introduce us to or underline. And in another reference to the church, in his book, Cayley says that the church for Illich is the modern state in embryo. I wonder how many of us who live in Western, what's referred to as Western society, think of our governments as emanating from the Catholic Church. Would you mind commenting on these ideas? You've also included the idea that the citizen originated in the Catholic Church. And topics that are very current right now, words such as patria, mother tongue, and pro patria mori, for my country I will die. And I think we see that as an influence in what's happening right now in what's going on between Ukraine and Russia, making all of this very current. But David, would you mind elaborating on what you've presented in your book?
Well, I can try, Charlie. First of all, I greet you all. I wish I were there. For those in Cuernavaca, it's a place of happy memory for me. I don't know the city at all well. I'm not Spanish speaking, but when I tended to go there in order to hang out with Ivan Illich. But those are very happy memories. So I greet you all. The question is impossible to answer briefly. I would say, first of all, that I think what Ivan incubated throughout his life, that is, when he found himself in Puerto Rico after having been a parish priest in New York, became the vice rector of the Catholic University at Ponce in Puerto Rico, and then through that was on the school board and was asked for the first time in his life to think about schooling, a subject he said he had never considered in any way. The first thing he noticed about the Puerto Rican school system and the millenarian hopes that were invested in it was its religious atmosphere, its clear descent from the Catholic Church. So he began incubating this idea very, very early on. I think he thought it all his life, and disclosed it partly in his work. I think disclosed it at the end in a book that a set of interviews for the CBC that became a book called The Rivers North of the Future. He disclosed it more fully, but reluctantly. I think that's important. I think many of his counselors opposed his disclosing it at all because they felt it would necessarily almost be misunderstood. You know, that the Catholic Church, by then we're in the 1990s, where in the United States, some of these people in New England, where a major scandal was erupting over the behavior of priests in Boston. It seemed very risky to many of his counselors to speak at all about this subject. And so I think he was brave to do it. I'm grateful that he trusted me. I think that the intervening years, which are now 25 approximately, have very much confirmed everything that in scholarly milieu, at least, have very much confirmed everything that Ivan claimed was the case. I think he felt himself at the end of the 90s to be an isolated figure. I think And I was surprised at the uptake of that book, The Rivers North of the Future. I think much that he said has been accepted. It would be impossible for me here, and it's in the book, to argue all the ways in which the church is the nursery, the incubator, the model of modernity. That's one of the ideas that I think is much more plausible today than perhaps when he began thinking it. So let me just draw attention to what I think is the action end of this proposition, which is that most of the people in my milieu believe that they have renounced and even that they oppose Christianity. To take one example, the scandal over residential schooling of Canada's Indigenous people cast the church entirely in the blackest colors. They're pure villains. One can barely speak at all about Christianity, and there is people believe they have renounced, overcome their religious heritage. If Illich is right, they're all Christians. He said to me, interestingly, this is in The Rivers North of the Future, it's reproduced in this book that we're talking about. When talking about the word apocalypse, and finally admitting, after having distanced himself throughout his life about the very ambiguous and explosive language of apocalypse in Christian tradition and the ways it's appropriated politically, that he would admit that our time was apocalyptic, and also that it is, he says, the most Christian time. An interesting statement. So people, but this is all subconscious in a certain way. It's embodied in institutions. It's embodied in the strange faith in schooling. It's embodied in the strange obedience to the maternal state during the pandemic that we've just seen. I think, I can't believe that you are all as obedient as Canadians were, but I mean, Canada has been just remarkable, the embrace of this maternal state that's going to care for us. It's embodied in technoscience, in medicine, in the way we form our ideas of technology. In every way, we are subconscious, I exempt explicit ones, subterranean, subconscious, unaware Christians. And I think this has two implications. The one is it's difficult to recover the source if it's being blocked by its counterfeit, if I could put it that way. And the second is, it's very hard to get out of something that holds you unconsciously, that you don't really know the roots or sources of your action. You don't really know your tradition. I mean, indeed, you scarcely know it at all anymore. So I think that's another implication of what Ivan says, that if he's correct in his major claim, which is that the corruption of the best is the worst, the institutionalization and reification of the gospel is the underlying dynamic of the entire civilization. It's a bold and remarkable claim, and I think it's full of implications for our time.
I mentioned the 1960s, you mentioned the 1990s. I wonder if we could talk about Illich's concept of time a bit, and I wonder if he had a linear concept of time. I remember him talking, you telling us that he told you about a professor of his that died in 42. That was 1142. And he was fascinated with the 12th century. And it was a watershed year, watershed century.
Yes.
And he talks about the 1960s. It's another watershed century. But can you elaborate on the importance of this 12th century and his interest in it?
Well, I mean, let's start with the other end, the 1960s. I think Ivan sincerely believed that the time of CIDOC, that the time, the 60s as we call it now, although that's kind of a shorthand, was a time of extraordinary opportunity. There's all sorts of evidence in his books that he sincerely believed that, and that people could change, that there was a moment to, in effect, turn back, to not allow the growth of systems of all kinds, whether they are school systems, he called for the disestablishment of school systems, consciously using the term that had been applied to religion. But equally now we see with biomedicine and in every other area, he felt there was a moment of opening there, a road, if you like, not taken. Now, go back to the 12th century, I called my book with Ivan that was published just after he died, after a poem that he loved by the Jewish German-speaking poet Paul Celan, The Rivers North of the Future. It's a very short poem. Celan says, "Into the rivers north of the future I cast my nets." Well, where is that exactly? The rivers north of the future. I would say the only that Celan wants to be mysterious. Ivan loved it because it's mysterious, but if you have to specify where north of the future is, it's very likely to be in the past. That is where the rivers rise. And I think he believed in a living past. I think he believed in a past that changes with the present, as I would say manifestly it does. As we understand the present differently, what we understand to be the past changes with it. And so there are points that we can find in the past that not only modify our present, but potentially show us a different present. So this is true in the relationship with Hugh of St. Victor that you mentioned. He regards Hugh of St. Victor without qualification as a teacher in the philosophy of technology. That Hugh, standing on a cusp, on a dividing line, on a watershed, as Ivan sometimes said, had also had a brilliant way of bringing the Christian past into the present that he could see unfolding, that he embodied, because it was for Ivan, and this is another point in which much subsequent scholarship has confirmed and supported him, although he remains rarely acknowledged as an important intellectual figure, is that the much that is usually ascribed to the Renaissance and even our whole scheme of history, which we maintain, misleads us. the Middle Ages are merely an intervening period between a glorious antiquity and its rebirth in the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and so on. The Middle Ages are bracketed in that scheme, but there's a huge amount of scholarship now supporting the idea that the origins of our time, the beginnings of modernity, if you like, lie in the 12th century and afterwards, or even farther back. And so his sense of time, I think he didn't dispute that time flows and passes for us, but he certainly believed in a way that's been very, very inspiring for me in a living past. And he taught as if he believed in a living past, and he brought others into the presence of that past.
In your book, it is quite amazing to me that I never had to wonder who it is that is speaking. You were very clear in when it was Ivan Illich, or when you were commenting on what's going on, or somebody else was speaking. And I found that quite interesting and quite fascinating. And so in this that I'm going to read to you, me is referring to you. On another occasion, he told me that Thomism is like a delicate phase. This is referring to St. Thomas Aquinas. Something glorious, but apt to be broken when it was moved out of its time. So I don't think that Illich should be understood as a Thomisist, but rather as someone who gratefully and wholeheartedly acknowledged his formation within the Catholic tradition. In his remarks on Aquinas and the foundation of his mode of thought, he goes on to say that this architecture has made him intellectually free to move between the medieval and the modern, even into other civilizations. He mentions the world of Islam without getting dispersed. Freedom seems to me the keynote here. Illich utterly belonged to his tradition, but in belonging to it so completely, he was also free to go beyond it. Going from medieval to the modern is quite a concept. And it also leads me to think that his concept of time, another reason that his concept of time was linear. He kept building on the past rather than wanting to return to it.
Yes, I think that was something that was never well understood, certainly by his opponents. So in the church, what he insisted on again and again is that innovation and tradition form an indissoluble pair. They form a couplet. They can't really exist apart from one another except as oppressive forces. Either the dead hold of the past or the kind of riot of innovation we see in our world, which is unmoored, ungrounded. You know, when disruption becomes a good word in your economic culture, hello, what is going on? You know, you've come completely off your moorings. And so he, throughout his career in the church, he was always in the church, but his formal career in the church, which ended in '68, he tried to make that point. And I think, you know, the present and the past are related in the same way, probably, as opposites that are indissolubly linked. So So yes, he believed that the change would be catastrophe without a place to stand, without an anchoring, without a orientation. But he also believed, as I said, that he was not a Thomist, in the sense that what he took from Thomas, which was a huge amount, and can I put in a plug?
Yes, of course.
My friend Sajay Samuel, who is one of Ivan's successors and will in time be his literary executor, has started a website called Thinking After Illich. And on that website is a journal called Conspiratio, an important word for Ivan. And in the upcoming issue of that journal is an essay by a professor in Dallas called Bob Kugelman, who explores what Ivan took from Aquinas via Jacques Maritain, who was his teacher in Rome after the Second World War, on that subject. And it's a very fine essay. So that's my plug.
Thank you very much.
But that, as you said, I mean, what he said says it all. It made him free. He wasn't bound by it. He wasn't trying to go back. Now that came up again and again and again, right? It came up fatally in the discussion over gender, the book that was published in 1982, that was a series of lectures in Berkeley, where he was understood by many of his interlocutors to be really saying, let's go back, right? Let's resurrect traditional gender relations. And I think he was very far from thinking that. I think he was always focused on what we could do now, what was possible now, but always informed by the past.
In this same chapter that I was reading from, contradiction, which you've just mentioned, is one of the names for the equivocal character of Christian revelation. Throughout a lifetime of study, Illich saw the same mysterious pattern repeated. Again and again, he says, a gift of grace was transformed into a modern horror. The best became the worst. And this ambivalent character was innate and inevitable. I'm going to skip ahead. Illich is contradictory because only a Zoomreiter, a fence rider, as he called himself in his address to Catholic philosophers, can remain upright in a world as forgetful of where it has come from and where it is going as our late modernity. He stands, he says, with one foot in the tradition of Catholic philosophy and the other dangling on the outside, heavy with mud plots, scented by exotic herbs, through which I have tramped. He imagines himself as walking the watershed, observing the profoundly different and contradictory worlds lying on either side. And you go on to talk about gender in that reference. The issue of the watershed, again, is in there. I think I remember somebody from one of the Illich homages that was held here in Cuernavaca on 5-year anniversaries after his death. I kind of recall that Illich said that you can't engage in trying to resolve conflict unless you can understand the other side's point of view. Is that an Illich idea, or am I just pushing it?
No, I never heard the statement, but it seems characteristic to me, yes.
And being the fence rider, R-I-D-E-R.
Right.
would be that role.
Yes.
Now, for those of you that are here listening, you saw that he used a word that I've never seen before, and I don't even know which language it came from as a French writer.
German.
German.
Yeah, it's an old word for a witch also.
For a witch.
Sound right there. But
one of the wonderful things about David Cayley's book is that he always tells us what words in other languages mean. Many authors expect that we're supposed to know German, French, English, and Spanish, and whatever else is being inserted. And where that first jumped out at me in this book was back at the beginning, when he was talking about Ivan Illich being summoned to Rome and being subjected to an interrogation by the Congregation for the Faith, which is the descendant of the Inquisition. And he must have gone up a stairway to get into the room, and then down a stairway into the basement room where the interrogation was carried out. He walked in, and the person sitting behind the desk said, he said, "I'm Illich." As he walked in, "I'm Illich." And the person at the other side of the desk said, "Yes, I know." And Illich asked, "Who are you?" He said something like, "I'm your interrogator." And that's the type of conversation that went on. He demanded that the questions that he was going to be asked be given to him, and that he have the opportunity to read them. And he went back to his place of lodging, and he read them through the night, the 85 questions, which he described as being similar to the type of question of, are you still beating your wife? And in the morning, he returned, and he told the interrogator that he was not going to be answering any questions. And not only that, but he was going to keep the list of questions. And Cardinal Scepter came in, and they spoke in Croatian. And finally, the Cardinal said, "Get out, get out, get out, and don't ever come back." He said it in Croatian because that's the conversation was going on in that language. And so Illich did what he was told, and he left, and he went up the stairs, got to the lobby, I guess, and then went down. As he was going down the stairs, he realized that what the Cardinal had said were the last words in Dostoevsky's story of the brothers Karamazov. That's as much as I'd ever heard about that. Everybody else that wrote about this always said, supposed that I'd read the book, and if I hadn't read the book, I would go and buy it and read it. David Cayley, on the other hand, tells us why it's so important and who the conversation was about. And you'll find that over and over again if you read Ivan Illich, the intellectual journey. Is David Cayley watches out for us as readers and watches out for the content. And throughout the reading of it, I felt that he was giving us an accurate view of what's going on. Very little editorializing. And when he did, he would explain why or what he was answering to. And it's a refreshing type of book to read. And I thank you very much for that, David, of taking the readers into account so much. I keep going back to this idea of linear versus circular time, because it seems to me that the Catholic Church, and in fact all Christian churches, we just go around in circles every year. We celebrate Jesus' birth in December, and 3 or 4 months later we're celebrating his crucifixion, and we have the same festivities, and it seems like a circle that we're going on. But for him, I think it was quite different. Well, I've got it here in a note. I do want to read something that he sets right here in this valley that we are in Cuernavaca. And he said, "In Mexico, when I say my prayers, I always bow towards Popocatépetl and Ixtlacihuatl, the masters of the valley in which I live. I want them to behave like the idols or spirits you can see in Romantic churches on the capitals, the dragons, the whales, and the mermaids. They are all there in the Romantic church to carry the building which represents the whole universe, the cosmos, which lies in God's hands. This hospitality to local spirits and local customs was gradually lost with the reform of the church that began around the turn of the millennium. We learned through your book, David, that Illich was well aware that the role of the clergy was going to be changing, and the role of the church, in the sense of church buildings, was going to be changing, and that people would soon be meeting in people's homes around a dining room table, and one person that, similar to the person that's the clergy person today, would be leading the conversation and leading the study group. But his good friend here in Cuernavaca, Bishop Sergio Mendez Arceo, said, yes, but we need to preserve the cathedrals. Remember that?
Yeah.
And certainly the cathedral here in Cuernavaca is a magnificent building. And it was that same bishop who was the one that consecrated it, even though it's a building that was built in the 16th century. It hadn't been consecrated as a cathedral until the mid-1950s, either 1957 or 59, because it had never been built to be a cathedral. It had been built to be a simple Franciscan church. All through that building, Bishop Mendez Arceo had the walls scraped and the plaster removed in the 1950s. And if you go into it today, you'll see a lot of rope painted in there. And the ropes all have knots in them. And they, being a Franciscan church, they're the knots that the Franciscan members of the Franciscan order tie around their waist, since they don't have a belt, and they leave two ends of the rope dangling down the right-hand leg, and they can lift up the rope and run it through their hands, and be reminded of their three vows as they feel the three knots. And Illich, in your book, speaks about those vows, which he wasn't a Franciscan. He wasn't a member of any order, correct?
No, he was not.
Yeah. And, but in the course of a retreat in Milwaukee in 1964, Ivan commended the monastic vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity as representing the three great dimensions of renunciatory self-definition. Poverty he defined as detachment from anything that might come between the believer and God. Obedience as bowing to and bearing with the person I am with, out of profoundest respect for their otherness. And chastity as a freedom from permanent commitment in order to be totally committed in the moment. He was pretty much surprised, he says, to find that almost all of the religious superiors he was addressing at this retreat objected very strongly to such a negative interpretation. But the obedience is something that he mentioned when he met you. Or you met him in 1970 first, right? At a meeting that you organized along with your commune in Toronto, and then you ran into him again in 1975 or 76, just briefly at a meeting in Vancouver. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then at a meeting in, what was it, 1980?
87 in Toronto.
87 in Toronto.
When Ivan had written a book called ABC, The Alphabetization of the Western Mind. So recognizing that after his great work of the 1970s, deschooling, medical nemesis, tools for conviviality, that these, he felt, had been written under a set of assumptions that he began to think no longer obtained. Let's say roughly after 1980, he began to think this way. So these works of the 70s all belong to what he came to think of as the age of tools. So even the largest of these systems were still instrumentalities operated by people who saw them as tools and could potentially change them as such. And the great change he saw in the 80s, which he began to call the age of systems, was that people no longer saw themselves as standing outside some instrumentality and operating it. They saw themselves as standing inside systems. And the system, as it fed back to them, would change with them. They would dance with the system, but they were enclosed. A different mentality, a difference greater, he said, than he thought he would observe in his lifetime. And he wanted to explore it. And his way of exploring it was to explore earlier watersheds, the transformation from an oral to a literate society in ancient Greece, the watershed that he later developed in a book called In the Vineyard of the Text in the 12th century and around that time, when the manuscript page of the monkish book was transformed into what he thought was the prototype of a modern scholarly tool, what he called the emergence of the visible text. So he had just written that book, and a group of, really, you might say, the successors of Marshall McLuhan, for those who know that name, at the University of Toronto, had put together a conference to assemble all the people who had thought about the relations of orality, primarily speaking societies, and literate societies. Ivan was there. I made a proposal to him to come and do interviews with him, which he said was completely out of the question. He hadn't done such a thing in years and had no desire to do such a thing. The next day, or the day the conference ended, we were all standing outside in the sunlight at Emmanuel College, and my wife and my 3 then young children came to greet me, to meet me after my work was finished. And Ivan looked over and he said, "You know what you said yesterday? Write to my friend Wolfgang Sachs about that, would you?" And clearly something had happened on the spur of the moment. In the instant, he had revised what he thought. And when I did write to Wolfgang Sachs, I got a letter back months later from Ivan, which looked like he typed it with his fingers on the wrong keys of the typewriter. But in it, he invited me to come to State College, Pennsylvania, where he was then teaching at the fall term at the Pennsylvania State University, and also promising me his obedience. A very, at the time, puzzling expression to me. I didn't quite know how to interpret it. So I learned in 2 short years of acquaintance after that to understand what he meant by it. And I think what he meant was the dance of friendship. It certainly didn't mean doing everything I said he ought to do, and nor vice versa. But it did mean a kind of, you quoted the bowing to, it did mean a kind of submission, as in Islam. It did mean a kind of listening. Yeah, and it did mean a kind of bearing with that I learned from endlessly, and he was my model, I would say. He was my example. in that.
But he trusted you more than he seemingly trusted anybody else. You, by that time, were a noted radio, what do you call yourself?
Well, I just
you had a program on ideas.
Yeah, I had a program on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
And you had a skill, which very few people have, of being able to preserve what he said. It's not hearsay. You have what he said on tape. And I think he must have realized that your intellectual honesty with the use of these tapes was going to be the way that his thoughts would be able to be preserved beyond the end of his years.
Well, that's an example of obedience. But another person comes into this story at this point who I hope someone listening remembers, who is Lee Hoynatsky, who was Ivan's sidekick, bosom friend, and I would say at times a kind of Sancho Panza to Ivan's Don Quixote. And Lee, so this didn't happen all at once. Ivan opened himself to what I had in mind all at once. He really did. But it was Lee who wrote to me after the interviews had been broadcast, and that would have been the end of the story. And broadcasting is very ephemeral, right? Here today, gone tomorrow. But Lee asked, and I had loved Lee from the moment I set eyes on him, and if he could have the tapes. I said, of course. You can have whatever you ask me for. And he transcribed them. He sent them back to me, and by chance I met a publisher at that very moment, and they made a book that was interesting because a lot of people hadn't understood the written Illich. I think his writing was very precise, very pointed, very exact, and I think for many readers very exacting. And I luckily was at home in it. I had, as soon as I began reading him in 1969, he was my man. But so to hear the spoken Illich was, I think, transforming for even people who were friends and who knew him. They heard a different note. They saw what he was getting at in a different way. So it changed his life, even as it changed my life. And that was what was entailed in obedience. And that was then intensified later in the 90s with these interviews that I mentioned earlier that became the Rivers North of the Future, that were much more adventurous, let's say.
Some of us in this room have listened to those tapes of the ones that led to the Rivers North of the Future.
Yes, The Corruption of Christianity, it was called on the CBC.
And his voice is very harsh and Germanic, and was kind of startling to me at the beginning. And after about the second hour, I started to like it and miss it. But I could tell that he was very carefully choosing what he was saying. And
well, Charlie, can I throw in that the care, this is something I would not have told at the time, was partly because he was trying to manage a new set of false teeth. and you can, if you listen, I shouldn't say this, but Ivan will forgive me. It's been a long time, but it was hard. I mean, it was a remarkable feat of self-mastery to speak, because those programs were lengthy dictations. They were not interviews. I would not have known. I didn't know what was coming. How would I have known to ask for it? It was me saying, I want to discuss this idea, corruptio optimi pessima. He saying initially, I'll write about it. Next time you see me, you'll get several chapters. No chapters were ever given. And finally, I said, may I come with my microphones and we'll talk this out. But I didn't know what we were going to talk about beyond a kind of sketch. And even, sometimes he would tell me what was on the agenda for the next day. So it was entirely his performance of this idea that had been developing throughout his life. And there was also this difficulty in elocution having to do with the teeth. And it was remarkable, given how unwell he was at times, that he did it at all. And the most remarkable thing, we didn't ask, but I'm going to say this, is that as far as I know, if I hadn't asked, that might never have been given. And because I esteem that book and what is said in it more highly than anything, in my, well, certainly in my public intellectual life, the idea that he would allow it to turn, whether it would come into being or not, that it would turn on whether the right person, as he considered, presented themselves at the right time. I mean, for him, a central scene is the Annunciation. Refers to it again and again. The angel, we're told, we see the wings, we see the halo in 1,000 paintings, but who knows who knocked at Mary's door and told her that she was pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Who knows how? I mean, there are wonderful modern poems like Denise Levertov's Annunciation, in which the scene is brought back to earth in a way. The angel loses his wings. That it all depended on her, right? And I think it was the case. And I'm not enough of a theologian to tell you more, that he believed that the incarnation, as it was, hinged on that moment. It might not have been, because he says to me in another place in that book that the incarnation is a surprise, remains a surprise, and could not exist as anything else. Is a surprise, remains a surprise, and could not exist as anything else. That last part, could not exist as anything else, is very strong, right? It makes you feel that the world depends on us now, in this moment, right? It's not a given. It hasn't been determined, right?
So it brings it up.
And it might be different. It could be different. To a degree, it is different. So
now, Illich remembered Goodman, a friend of his, telling him that Goodman, had never written a line that he could not as easily have spoken. This caused Illich to reflect that he was in the exactly opposite case. He had never written a line which I have the feeling I could have said. I remember my father telling me that he learned either from Illich or from people talking about Illich that he was very careful in what he wrote so that it could not be pulled out of context and used against him. I think that with his multiple languages and his feeling of being uprooted made him trust written text much more than spoken. And you are a transition from written to spoken, and you're taking the spoken word and putting it into writing. And
Well, yeah, in that respect, had you finished, or did I interrupt you?
No, I ran out. I didn't find. I've got it right here. Hold on a second.
Let's see, finish before, and I'll answer.
Illich had as agile and discerning a mind, but he was not a systemic thinker who worried overmuch about the consistency and completeness of his thought, which seems to go against what I just told you. But in an examination of what Illich has said and meant, oh, wait.
That's him talking to me.
He says to you, yes. Wait a second.
Yeah, because
yes, okay. When in 1988, when I tried to get him to revisit the old text, this is now David Cayley speaking, that I had carefully reread in preparation for my first major interview with him, he joked that in an examination of what Illich has said and meant, you would pass with flying colors, and I wouldn't get a passing mark.
I know. It was a wonderful moment. But I think you can reconcile, or at least recognize, that they're a harmonious contradiction, those two statements, right? He was extremely careful. He was extremely precise. His rhetoric is beautiful, I think, beautifully made. But he did also have the capacity to then say, well, yeah, that was then, this is now. That's what I said then in that circumstance. So he did not want to be held to past texts, and he did not think they were adequate in the present. So I think that in that sense, he was an oralist, right? A person who did believe that what passed in the moment between people was the crucial business. So
he wanted to be remembered exactly as he had spoken, and you're the one that does that.
So in that sense, even though he says that about Paul Goodman that you quoted earlier, right? That Goodman had a wonderfully fluent, almost to a fault, literary style. It was very conversational, very easy, right? Whereas Ivan was the opposite, right? Just kind of Thomistic precision, question, response, etc. But on the other hand, he was a brilliant speaker, and you hear it again and again in what he achieved in the River Songs of the Future, especially, right? That's all spoken off the cuff. Off the cuff of a lifetime's reflection, but still spoken spontaneously. And it is at times eloquence itself. So
now I've just been told that the hour is up. You're not off the hook though, because now we have an hour of questions and answers.
Oh, I'm at your service.
And but one more thing, and we haven't even dealt with the Good Samaritan, and we haven't dealt much with corruption of the best is the worst. But let me just one more sentence here. Illich says, "I wish I could find a way of never appearing like a preacher who focuses your attention on the scenery on only one side of the watershed. Once thinking becomes a monocular perception of reality, it's dead.
Right. I can't improve on that. It's that's the essential thought of what we call tradition and innovation, right? It's the essential thought of what I, in the conclusion of the book, called complementarity, that only complementary perspectives can give us a whole. So, yeah, I think he really did have such a mode of thought that recognized that contradiction could not be surpassed in language, in the stuff of the world. It may well be surpassed beyond the horizon of our thought. It may well be reconciled in God. But as to what we live and speak, yeah, that was critical. So let's go to the questions.
Okay. Does anybody here in this room have any objection to me just turning the camera around so he can see who it is that's present? Can
I love that. Oh, that's a great idea.
Can you do it? I'm going to have our technician do it because otherwise it'll be me ruined it all.
Well, there you all are. Very nice. You're a little in shadow, but I can see you all.
Okay, so we'll be back in 5 minutes.
Okay, good. As will I.
Carol Hopkins, here we go. I have a question from Carol Hopkins, and you've spoken with her on the phone, and you've been in correspondence with her.
Yes.
She asks, I was moved by Illich's stammer to you, acknowledging he was running out of time, and asking you, trusting you, with his legado, essentially the work of putting 30 years of Illich's life work on how the church failed itself by, from the best, becoming the worst. Putting it into words which could have been Illich's own. How did this commitment to Illich's request affect you personally? Any regrets?
No, certainly no regrets. This was an infinitely enriching and continuing friendship. So it was certainly an obligation. It was clear to me that when I left the CBC, if there was still strength and breath in me, and it chanced that there was a change of regime, and it was a convenient moment for me to leave, that this was the first thing that I would want to do. It was clear to me that he was in earnest, Ivan was in earnest in viewing the Rivers North of the Future for all its eloquence and its polish in places as what he called a research hypothesis, or as a sketch, as something he wanted to leave with people to think about, to improve on, to develop. And I really think that work has just begun. I really meant what I said at the beginning, that I think that he does indicate a largely unconscious civilization. He describes a largely unconscious civilization that will not be able to save itself without bringing what is unconscious to consciousness. It may not be able to save itself even then, depending on which predictions one believes about the future. But certainly, I think that's crucial. I hope that answers, Carol.
She thanks you. Another question is, how do you see Illich as relevant today?
Well, I've been trying to say that, but let me try and give a concrete answer to that. There's so many ways in which one could answer that. Let me take two aspects of it. One, Ivan wrote an essay called 3 Dimensions of Public Option. It had various incarnations. It's in shadow work. It circulates in several other forms, but there he says that he thinks the political map that we operate with doesn't describe the political territory in which we're living. It's the left-right axis on which we plot political opinion doesn't describe the real choices that we face. It's real to the extent that we haven't overcome what the left-right axis was set up to describe, which is the relative proportions of state and market. But he thinks there are many other ways, certainly vis-a-vis technology, but also vis-a-vis the relationship between vernacular life, as the term he proposed, and professionalized existence. None of these dimensions are in our political language. And consequently, we've seen, the pandemic for me has revealed a very strange complicity of the left, the political left, with the pharmaceutical industry, with an oppressive state apparatus, but with no language with which to get to grips with that, right? I think they're completely preoccupied with the dangerous rabble that they see on the right. It was embodied for us in Canada by this event that I think became a bit world famous, which was this bunch of truckers came to Ottawa to protest vaccine mandates. Now, to me, they were essentially standing up for the Nuremberg Declaration of 1947. They were, but to the people on the left, they were seen as a dangerous white supremacist, et cetera. All these terms were deployed, rabble. And so we're in a polarization that is, it's going to get worse because people are making it worse every day by stereotyping, by not talking, and by having no language, no way to describe the actual situation. So I think that's an example of where Illich, who in this respect belongs to a whole school of political ecology that also Leopold Kohr, Fritz Schumacher, and others, you would align him with that. The scale issue that is identified as crucial in tools for conviviality is still not present in our politics in any articulate form. So to take the second issue, climate change. Ivan, I think, although he never, to my knowledge, really addressed this issue, would have drawn attention to the way in which the movement to indicate and address climate change fixes on us all sorts of techno-scientific and bureaucratic assumptions about how we are to live, right? Which are scale issues, right? That if we lived within limits, we would live freely, right? But we want to live recklessly under control, and that's what the discourse of climate change and denial of climate change, the whole way the discourse is constructed, fixes certain assumptions on our minds. And I think Ivan has a different way of looking at it, a way of stepping outside it, which isn't for or against, which isn't a denier or a carbon tax maniac or whatever, however the fruitless dialogues are set up. And our politics is nothing but fruitless dialogues of the deaf at the moment. I think Ivan has a language and an approach. It's not the only one in that respect. I mean, you know, if somebody wants to follow Gandhi rather than Illich, they'll be following the same path, or Schumacher, or lots of others. So I don't want to make Ivan the only one in that respect. He was just my teacher. But I think he does have the ideas, the words, and the concepts by which we could, if we allowed ourselves, could construct the situation differently and deal with it differently than we do. So that's my answer on contemporary relevance.
From Mick Tanner. What would you tell us as first-time readers to help us quickly start to understand and enjoy the book?
Which book?
My
book or or Illich's book?
Your book. And I wonder if Mick means should you start in a particular place in your book, or should you start reading another one of your books first?
Well, that's an interesting question.
Can you tell me if I first met it, what would you tell me about the book?
It's true that one could read The River Snows of the Future first, and benefit from that, and Ivan Illich in Conversation, which is the literary deposit of the first encounter, or listen to the programs which are on my website. That might be helpful. As far as how that book can be read, I know it's a dreadful tome. I do think individual parts of it can probably be read, are probably intelligible in themselves. It probably has, I hope it has, a cumulative a momentum, and that builds on itself. But I think there are also parts of it that could stand more or less by themselves as discussions of those issues. My only apology for its length is that 76 years is a long time, and Ivan did a lot of things and covered a lot of different topics, and that to really get to grips with all of them, it took that long.
Thank you. There's another question. No name attached to it, but Illich seems to romanticize the institutional church to accept injustices. Did he have a capacity to turn his analytic sharpness to the institution's grave failures?
I'm not sure what to make of that question. I thought he was thrown out of the church for turning his attention to its great failures. I don't see him as an apologist for the church, so I can't answer.
What would Illich, this one's coming in Spanish, what would Illich propose for the church to be able to recover its ethical vision and get out of the epoch of being the show? ¿Qué propondría Illich para recuperar la ética de la visión, salir de la época del show? Alicia Dorantes.
Well, I think Ivan took seriously the root of the word ethics in ethos, which perhaps in Spanish, certainly in English, you can speak of the ethos of something, right? Its atmosphere, its way of being, so that he saw a great deal of ethics, of contemporary ethics, as you see in the ethical procedures that are imposed on university professors before they're allowed to do something, or in bioethics. It was a particular bête noire for Ivan, because he wrote specifically what he called a call to debunk bioethics. That is, there were a lot of situations in which he thought ethics were a sham because there was no ethos, and there could be no ethics without ethos. And so I think that he saw the rebuilding of what he tried to call vernacular. Now that was in his book Shadow Work. There are a couple of essays that do the spade work for the idea of vernacular, which was a word in English, at least, that really was used only for language and a little bit in architecture. But he said we need a word for everything that is within our grasp, within the ambit of a community or culture, in a limited sense. Everything that does not belong to professional hegemony, everything that doesn't belong to the market, but which we do for ourselves, and which he called not because no money changes hands, or because it's not useful for me to pay you for something you've done for me. It's not the issue. It's whether subsistence was a word that I think he used and was never understood well in using it, because this goes back to something we talked about before. It has this medieval root, right? What subsists, theologically speaking, is what can exist in and for itself. And so he used subsistence and thought, which in English really means a bare living, right? If people talk about a subsistence farming or subsistence agriculture, or there's various ways in which the word is used, it always implies something barely adequate, right? A mean living. And I think it was misleading to people. He didn't mean that. He meant a new way of life with a decent independence of professional tutelage and of market or commodity domination. And I think he saw that to speak of ethics in a situation where people had no independence was a bit of a sham or a travesty. So I don't know if that that answers the question I was asked or not, but
A good answer. A question from Cuernavaca resident who's not here present right now, but Ivan Illich emerged as a philosopher and social critic at a time when the nation was engulfed in widespread protest over war, sexism, racism, and social inequality. In books and talks, he questioned whether educational and medical institutions had grown too big and powerful. But what did he think about racial inequality? Did he oppose the war in Vietnam? In his view, did women have a right to choose, or was their right obligation to remain in place? He had been a priest, but did he believe in God and the teachings of the gospel? What did he have to say about forgiveness? You can say it came from someone in the audience.
Well, that's quite a question. And I don't know if I understand what it means, but he didn't see himself as somebody who ought to say something on every topic or tell people what to think. He was very much, I think, a critic. He once, and I've said this in the book, he once said to his friend John McKnight that he believed in proscription, not in prescription. So he didn't prescribe because he didn't think he knew how to prescribe. He didn't describe what a new church, which an expression he used, would look like because he didn't think he knew what it would look like. He made some suggestions that you quoted one, Charlie, about, the table would be hallowed, the friends around a table would be hallowed rather than strangers around an altar and so on. He was a phrase maker, and he gave some intriguing pictures of it, but he didn't think he could say what it would or should be. So he really was a prescriptive thinker because he did think there were certain things that would make it impossible. A certain scales of professional intervention, let's say, would make the regrowth of a vernacular society impossible. So I don't know that Ivan ever had a lot to say about racism. He certainly opposed the war in Vietnam. He was a pacifist. He was a Christian. And he was present at the 1967 demonstrations at the Pentagon. I know that for a fact. On the right to choose, I would say that he absolutely affirmed the sovereignty of women in certain matters. I think he hoped, but he had a very complicated position about it because he rebukes Cardinal Ratzinger, who went on to become Pope Benedict, for hallowing a clump of cells as a Christian person. So he really questioned the pro-life movement to the extent that it was reifying scientific abstractions. He wanted to emphasize the lived experience of expectant women and families to a much larger extent. So his position on that issue was, I would say, pretty nuanced, and I think largely he stayed out of the whole debate. I think because he would have regarded it as another fruitless dialogue of the deaf, constructed on terms that he wanted to question and which he thought people ought to question. So that there might be whether behind this question is the idea, was Illich a cop-out? Was he a traditionalist posing as a radical, or was he somebody who didn't really oppose all the evils he ought to have opposed? I can't speak for him. But
thank you. I have a question that arrived earlier this morning from Hernando Calla.
yes, I know the man.
You know him?
I do.
Okay.
Well, we're correspondents. We haven't met yet.
All right. That's good then. He starts with a bit of introduction, so I hope he won't be offended if I sort of consolidate his question. He's asking about chapter 13, Apocalypse. It's seen as a tragic version of Christianity that Illich would have and would have expressed to the author towards the end of his life, the rivers. Could it be said that this vision of a certain inevitability of the corruption of the Christian message was always permeating Illich's perceptions, even in the years in which he was publishing books and essays, and recognized the respect the existence of certain multi-dimensional boundaries beyond which destruction lurked, but who at some point became radicalized when he perceived that humanity had crossed a threshold that placed us in an entirely different time, the age of systems, that can only be understood as a projection of Christian ideas, albeit maddened by their own integration into global systems. Is it a threshold of no return? If there is no turning back, how can we continue to live our respective, more or less modern circumstances with a minimum of good sense, common sense, and decency?
Okay, well, I think there's a couple of questions there, at least. Two were immediately discernible to me, so let me try and address those. There's Hernando will know this. There's a passage that's in The Rivers North of the Future that's in this book that I've commented on because it was such a challenge to me. I've said that The Rivers North of the Future interviews were not interviews, they were dictations. Well, he hadn't gone very far along in the first one when he said to me, I can't go any farther without saying this, what I have not said for, gives a period of time, 40 years perhaps?
30.
But I have avoided saying for 30 years?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that one cannot face the world we're living in without facing the temptation, I think he says, to curse the incarnation. Right? It's my jaw dropped open, and I also then had to take that home and try and decide whether I wanted to, what was I going to do with it? If he couldn't avoid saying it, I couldn't, he knew it was a radio interview. I couldn't avoid broadcasting it, but I didn't want to broadcast it because it seemed too vulnerable, too easily mistaken, that a temptation was being talked about not a temptation succumbed to, presumably, but a temptation faced. So I think the answer must be that that temptation had been there, and if it's been avoided for 30 years, it's been there all along, right? That he has lived then in the consciousness of the, how can I say it, the evil effects of what he holds to be most true. And I think that must have been there. So, yeah, there must have been there. He was a somewhat clairvoyant man, very quick to understand the implications of the circumstances he was in, the people whom he met, and so on. So he was attuned in an unusually sensitive way. So yes, I think he must have long held what I very tentatively, I hope, tried to suggest might be called a tragic view of Christianity. So that's one question. The idea of the point of no return is the crossing of the threshold and so on. I mean, it's patent that Ivan thought and argued with me about it, because I had come to see him in the late 80s, completely taken with his earlier work, and the stuff that he now told me was dead written stuff of another time, in which I was better versed than he was and would get a better grade than him on an Illich exam. He clearly took more seriously than I did at that moment, and I learned with him, through him, to take it seriously, that we have crossed this threshold. We are in this new reality. I continue to hope that certain kinds of clarifications are possible. I mean, I think we've just, in Canada, I shouldn't talk to Mexicans about tragedy, probably. We've been through a little tragedy, which was this affair that I mentioned of the truckers' convoy, in which I felt I was watching a spontaneously formed public try to get a hearing. And the result was that they were scorned, mocked, insulted, and driven into the very position that in a way had been prepared for them by their enemies. Now, some may have been in that position already, but many others, I think, were not. And so clearly we're sowing the wind, we're going to reap the whirlwind. I have that hope. On the other hand, I think it's probably going to be necessary to define what I would only surely by analogy would call a new monasticism, and something like what Benedict and his brothers did when they withdrew. That there have to be ways of taking care of each other, of fostering and keeping alive certain ideas, so that we pass them on through a coming time that can only be terrible. It can only be terrible because we're ensuring every day that it's going to be terrible. And, you know, in the United States, seems to threaten to break into civil war, but you have a number of ongoing civil wars in Mexico as well. And so, so I don't believe in a point of no return. It's not a position I can hold, but I can try and be practical and say, I can see that what is being done is going to produce this result. And it's going to be pretty terrible.
We have two more questions, one of them which has been passed to me in writing, and another one that I've gotten from a number of different people is, how is the study of Illich applicable and important to college students of today? Or is it something that's left over from the 60s?
Well, I tried to answer that question earlier as to political relevance. College students, so let me address the element of college students. I don't think that we really have much of a university left. We have an egregious institution which has small pockets of holdouts. So the university in Canada, at least, is a corporate institution. I mean, I've been hearing for 30 years from university teachers that I was well out of it, and that's funny. I mean, I was a radio broadcaster, and I because I never got more of an education than an undergraduate degree, I always kind of reverenced the scholars, the university people, and was surprised to have them come and say to me that I was the one that had the good situation, and that they were appalled by what was going on in the university. And but I really don't, I think the challenge there is of speaking to college students would be to create the places in which one could speak to college students, right? Which is not the indoctrination system which prevails in the university. So I don't know if that answers.
And this last question. Why?
Oh my God, that's from Vijaya.
We'll read that one next. Why did so many people follow Ivan Illich? What was it about him that was so powerful? What made them come to Cuernavaca to listen to what he had to say? Can you explain his magnetism?
No, I can't explain it. I think that one will have to be posed to higher authority than me. He had it, right? He I think realized it as a young. I mean, there are special people, and I think realized as a boy, he told me that he realized that he had an unusual effect on people, and that it could be disorienting for them, and that was evident around him pretty much at all the times that I knew him, that people could easily get thrown off course, that they would be a little bit overpowered, and that he, I think, did all he could to shield that effect, but that effect was very real. That was just who he was.
Okay, this is about the previous question from Vijaya Nagarajan to everyone. It is increasingly relevant. I teach college students Ivan Illich's work nearly every semester, and I find that students take much from Illich's work. They see thoughts that speak directly to them. I start with H2O and the waters of forgetfulness, and it knocks them off their feet. And energy and equity works, and so too does tools for conviviality, and make it more current for today.
Well, that's hello, Vijaya. That's a much better answer than I gave when I was asked about college students. So I'd like to shelter behind the sorry of my friend.
Can I?
There you are. Hi.
Oh,
I just had to respond to that one.
That's very nice. And well, good.
Thank you.
the very last paragraph of your chapter, Illich's Way of Life. And this is you speaking. There are 3 points that I would like to reiterate in concluding this sketch of Illich's way of life as a thinker, writer, and weaver of communities. The first is the iconoclastic and ancillary character of his work. It is always about what must be renounced, broken, or set aside before one can enter into those communitarian forms of life in which he felt that the human face of God was revealed. In this sense, his work is a preparation, not a completion, a way rather than a destination. One enters, as he says, on a pilgrimage that leads not to a famed sanctuary, but by a way in which one does not know where the road might lead or the journey end. The second is that his work should be understood not as a hidden or camouflaged theology, but as theology practiced in a new way for a new era in which the consequences of the institutionalization of the Christian gospel are fully manifest in religion as a life apart, a separate sphere, no longer tenable. Finally, I think he should be taken at his word and read as a friend, the only vocation that is open to us, as he remarked to Romano Prodi, in a world in which the truth has already been revealed and already corrupted, and now lies buried beneath the weight of these deformations. I think we should thank you very much for sharing your time with us. And I didn't expect an answer from that because it was you speaking in the first place.
Yeah, I thought, who wrote that? I'd like to talk to that guy. Yeah.
But
thank you, Charlie. That was very nice to hear that.
And yeah.